A brand's name wields extraordinary influence. It shapes perceptions, feelings, and even stereotypes. Mrs. Fields, for instance, the name likely evokes the image of a kindly old grandmother making warm cookies in her kitchen. The reality, however, is quite astonishing. The founder of the brand, Debbie Fields, was very young. The name Mrs. Fields Cookies was a happy accident, and some people didn't even realize Mrs. Fields was a real person at the time, assuming her to be some sort of corporate creation like Mrs. Butterworth's or Mr. Coffee. Betty Crocker is another example. The story underscores the powerful role stereotypes play in shaping public opinion and highlights why researching and testing a brand name is a critical step in establishing a lasting identity. Consider the example of Warby Parker. They rigorously tested over 2,000 potential names to find one that exuded the tone of vintage English refinement. Remember, there is no Warby and there is no Parker. Debbie was born into a family led by a Navy welder with limited means. She loved baking at an early age, but had to get a job in order to fund her baking experiments with premium ingredients. She ended up getting a job at the Oakland A's, earning $5 an hour. After years of baking, she had become an expert in baking cookies, and she knew her recipes back to front. At age 19, she ended up marrying Randall Keith Fields, a Stanford graduate, well-established financial consultant. Randy supported Debbie's aspirations, and his business expertise later proved instrumental in their entrepreneurial journey. But Debbie really was the mastermind behind the brand. Her love for baking evolved into a desire to have her own cookies in the world, and she envisioned opening a store that sold freshly baked cookies made with the finest ingredients. This was a revolution. No one was doing this at the time. It may seem odd to have such a young person set out to open a store in a space that didn't exist, but she had been baking diligently for 6 years ahead of that. And that education and mastery of time is in line with what we might be described as an outlier. The R&D timeframe is traditional. It's the same dedication Nancy Silverman showed, obsessing over perfecting her sourdough bread. Long nights of testing, waiting to scale La Brea Bakery until the recipe was perfected and replicable. Was her cookie idea as revolutionary as Xerox? Probably not, but in a lot of ways the answer was yes. The principles for success aligned. In 1961, there's no way to copy documents onto normal paper. And again, there were no cookie shops like this. The word cookie didn't even have the same definition as it does today. The word didn't even exist in Japan, Hong Kong, Australia, or more. That information was found in her book, as well as many Reddit forums giving personal experiences to the fact that cookies weren't even a thing like that. Where it did exist, the definition was much different than the cookie that we know today. Before this, they were called biscuits or crisps. There was no chocolate. They were small, cold, and crisp. It wasn't until 1966, when Chips Ahoy had released its new famed chocolate chip cookie, that the category began to become a real thing. And even then, they were cold and crisp. Again, going back to Xerox, it's very similar to Mrs. Fields in that no one thought it would succeed. IBM and major players at the time and others passed because they didn't see it as viable. IBM ignored Intel's small consumer-based model and focused on the established business models. A very big mistake. It was a very revolutionary idea to want to open a store that sells premium warm cookies when no one else did it at a much higher price. People were used to paying 9 cents per cookie, not 25 cents per cookie, and more like $3.50 or more per cookie today. And these cookies were much larger than people expected. It was an untapped market with existing inherent demand, and it was destined to succeed, just like Xerox. Debbie would say there's a vast canyon lying between delicious and delicious for 12 cents. We build the product, then we price it, and let the customers decide if it's worth it or not. She may have known what happened to Hershey when they traded sugar cane with corn syrup in the early days and lost $60,000, which was a significant amount of money at the time, because retailers couldn't sell the new formula. Customers could taste the difference. Building the product and then pricing it flies in the face of traditional instruction. It's always price minus cost. Blue Ocean Strategy, the book, talks all about this. How Brands Grow talks about this. You have to pick the target market at the price customers want to see, then innovate your way to achieving it. Or don't do it at all. P&G had the same issue with diapers. It took them 13 years of manufacturer innovation to get the price down before going to market. Kodak broke through their market when they offered the Kodak camera at the right price for customers. And as a result, they dominated for 16 years while incumbents focused on improving old technology. But what's so amazing about Mrs. Fields' concept, and something that's perhaps unique about cookies, is that she can try something new and get it to market very quickly. If she wanted to test demand. It's almost what we would call rapid prototyping for durable goods, by 3D printing the product rather than running full production. so she could innovate on products at very low risk and very quick timeframes. Plus, when somebody psychologically goes into a Mrs. Fields to treat themselves, how many people are going to scrimp on the treat? Well, I'm already in the building to indulge. What's another 50 cents for the cookie I really want? And that philosophy served her well for a very, very long time. In hindsight, we can see that Mrs. Fields was a great idea. Crumble as well. This category was set to explode. Everyone should have seen what happened with Nabisco blowing up and jumped in, but they didn't. But for some reason, this wasn't obvious to people when she shared the idea. Like anyone. Not the finance friends, not her personal friends, her husband, certainly not the bankers who she tirelessly approached with a business plan and freshly baked cookies to demonstrate the quality of her product. And they would look at the plan, eat all the cookies, and say, thanks, but no. This is just a classic lighthouse brand. The idea is only obvious in hindsight. The founder needs vision to push through this and confidence the demand exists, even nascent demand. People turn down Uber. Uber is common. People just can't see the vision. All of Randy's clients, all the marketing specialists, all the professionals, family members, parents, friends from junior college, even her best friend growing up, Wendy, who was her guinea pig for cookie testing and trying for years and years, couldn't imagine the idea working. The idea seemed strange, concept didn't exist, they're writing it off. This story is very familiar to Frederick Smith with FedEx. He wrote a term paper as a grad student at Yale exploring the idea of overnight delivery service, and he received a grade of a C and a comment from a skeptical professor. Eventually, she ended up securing a $25,000 loan, but it came at a steep 21% interest rate. This is what I love about Debbie Fields, is she was determined to make it happen for herself. This really underscores the challenges of starting a business with established credentials. It was the late 70s, inflation was really high, but think about it. Would you personally go take out a loan for $25,000 at 21% because you had an idea, probably a harebrained idea of starting a business that no one else had ever started before? This is pretty brave. So the plan going in was to only sell hot cookies. That meant throwing away or donating to the Red Cross the remaining cookies that were unsold. When the first store opened, there were no sales, none. So in frustration, instead of throwing away the cookies, she cut them up and handed them out outside. This was not an elegant strategy, but she ended the day with $75 in a marketing strategy. Free samples. This tactic was discovered out of frustration, and she was facing the abyss, so she had to do something. Rather than throwing them in the garbage, she gave them away. The strategy did not change as she expanded the company, though, and they never spent money on advertising, if you can believe that. That is the power of really good product, too. Product market fit and a really good product. This is really a version of the explore-exploit trade-off. You have to explore, find out what works, and then exploit it when you figure out what it works. And she did that very well. Again, another reason she's a great entrepreneur. Time and time again in her career, she was able to identify a problem and then solve it fast. It's not uncommon to not plan on marketing exceptional products either. The founder of Chobani's products quality was so strong that it influenced his marketing strategy as well. The company focused on word of mouth and inherent quality of the product rather than traditional advertising methods early on. The rumor is that he went and tried all the competitors in America and everything was so bad compared to his that he said he didn't need to advertise. I don't know how much truth there is to that, but it could be. Also, he did some crazy things like put his phone number on packaging in the early days so customers could call the founder directly. That's pretty cool. But still, it was very grassroots. Debbie loved to say, good enough never is. The dedication to quality is constantly reflected in decisions they made. Enduring market leaders rarely achieve breakthroughs from luck. It's long years of optimizing the product followed by explosive success and growth. The two parts to the problem, quality ingredients and proper baking. It's a complex business they're in. You can't just hire any Joe Schmo off the street. They have to be a baker, and cookies have to be done correctly. Otherwise, they're not the same quality. This meant hiring quality team members as well as buying credible quality ingredients. In the early 1980s is a good example. Raisins were scarce due to the broad farm crisis. A financial downturn hit the Midwest farmers. That pushed farm debt to $215 billion by 1984, double what it was in 1978. Farm closures surged. This all matters because the raisin prices skyrocketed. And this is why the dancing, singing raisin commercial we all grew up seeing happened. But Mrs. Fields refused to replace raisins in her cookies with dates as a cost-effective substitute. The quality wasn't there. And she decided to pay the astronomical prices to get raisins. Push towards premium quality without sacrificing appears to be an innate decision that she continued to make. Nothing about this was normal. The point wasn't to make money. The point was to bake great cookies, and we sacrificed for that principle. How many entrepreneurs have that mindset? You got to remember, this is way before companies that prioritize quality were as common. This is way before Cliff, Ben & Jerry's. They weren't on the scene yet. Patagonia was still selling climbing gear made by hand and rugby shirts made from cotton. I mean, this is way before all these standard operating procedures for big brands were in place. She was a visionary of how to run a really great company here. Now, throughout the process of trying to keep quality high, she had to learn how to operate this business as it scaled because it was growing rather quickly. So they separated dry and wet ingredients, and that helps to avoid lumps and ensures even distribution of dry ingredients throughout the dough. Large scaling mixing equipment was used to handle large quantities, precise measurements to maintain quality, pre-mixed packets and dry ingredients were provided. That added a lot of consistency. She said it was the key to scaling this kind of business. Again, this goes back to her assembling the plane as she'd already jumped off the cliff. The ingredient system only serves half the quality problem, though. These cookies still need to be baked by hand. Not too much, not too little. They need to be just right. And that creates an enormous variable for the business with hundreds of locations. It's much less controlled than a system like McDonald's had built. Debbie went to great lengths to ensure quality baking standards were upheld. Best known for her act of walking into one of her locations, which she had not franchised at all. She owned all the locations herself to go test and look at the cookies. Seeing that they weren't up to her standards, she took the whole tray of cookies that had just been brought out of the oven and threw them in the garbage. That is a really intense way to control quality and standards above all. So obsessed was she with quality of all her locations that when they expanded into brownies, it was a big hit. But soon the taste at some of her locations wasn't right anymore. She made all of the store managers, 200 at the time, bake and mail in 4 of each version of the brownies so she could taste them. And then she sat down and literally tried all of them. And she found the problem and she solved it. Again, Debbie's gift was identifying problems, assessing solutions quickly, and solving the problem with creative solutions. In 1985 to 89, the company aggressively expanding, adding 225 new store locations in that period. They also took on more debt to do so. The growth included locations throughout the United States and international markets, and this is really a story of building with passion rather than for money. Her idea is that many of the best businesses out there start with a founder doing something they like or want for themselves. Then they made them for their friends. Then everyone started asking for it, and the company was born. Even Newman's own dressing started that way. Paul Newman would make salad dressing for himself, and then it expanded, and then he put his face on it and put it for charity. If you haven't seen a fun movie called Self-Made on Netflix about Madam C.J. Walker, I would definitely watch that. If you're watching this far into this video, you would love it. The chances of success for a person like this compared to the person who decided to go out and make millions of dollars and did, you don't hear that story very often, she says. And I believe she's right. For us today, this might not be a revolutionary concept, but back then it was really important. You know, we hear Instagram clips of Jack Dorsey talking about why Odeo failed and Twitter won, or Elon Musk talking about it's very hard and you have to care, otherwise you're not going to do it. It's Steve Jobs said you really have to be passionate about what you're doing, otherwise you'll quit. I mean, this is a very common thing, but back then it was very different. These were inherent things that she felt and understood as a business owner. One of the best quotes in this is from a book called In Search of Excellence, that companies tend to be founded by people with not totally stupid obsessions around which they've built their companies. With that in mind, she decided to create a macadamia nut cookie with an outrageous amount of macadamia nuts without a second thought. Randy told her, you know, we could never afford to sell a cookie like that because it's a very expensive nut. They raised the price and customers paid happily. The cookie ended up being the most popular, and at one point the company bought their own macadamia nut processing factory and ended up buying 8% of the world's macadamia nuts. As the company grew, Debbie had a unique way of hiring her team. She interviewed with the same intensity and quality standards she put into the cookies. She would ask interviewees if they liked sugar and butter in the interview, and if the answer wasn't an enthusiastic yes, her answer was no. Team members needed to be willing to put themselves out there. To determine this, she would ask them to sing happy birthday to her in front of the entire Mrs. Fields store right then, in the interview. She just had to get the right people on the bus, as Jim Collins puts it in his book, Good to Great. Now, she did learn some lessons here. She couldn't do things that the staff didn't appreciate. They would passive-aggressively boycott her. The idea for her, she discovered, was to empower bakers. One lesson she learned was with mini pecan pies a woman made and delivered and sold in the first store. She brought them and they resold them, basically. Now, they tasted perfect, but they didn't sell. And when Debbie asked why they hadn't sold, it was because the team didn't try to sell them, because they didn't bake them. They felt like a fraud. It wasn't their product. Pride in your work is what we're talking about. And pride in your work is what HP and Les Schwab and many other wonderful brands have as a cornerstone of their business. And Debbie had the perceptiveness to see this and not force it upon her team. but back away and let the bakers bake. This is because baking is a skill. Making the cookies by hand was a point of pride for these bakers, and she had inadvertently taken that away from them. Now, by 1990, they had 600 locations, so all of them were owned by Debbie and her husband, Randy. Now, in order to incentivize the team members, they had to have a performance plan. And everybody was offered minimum wage, and a commission was funded based on store sales, top line. I think this was a perfect comp structure for a company that relies on handing out free samples for marketing. People are empowered to drive sales based on their actions, and this kind of structure is a good idea when the owner wants to keep control of the company and finance is private, and also the profit is the ownership's problem, not the staff's. Additionally, team leads and management bonuses were keyed to sales as well. Managers never saw the P&L, no profit focus, and the key here is that otherwise they would not throw cookies away. Remember, they had to throw uneaten cookies away after 2 hours. This allowed them to focus on top-line sales and making people happy and not trying to get every single cookie sold. That's why the top line is so good. As any good leader of a company, she was focused on sales and driving top-line revenue, and she set hourly goals for herself and required managers to do the same. And rather than enforcing the practice by command, Randy Fields embedded the notion in the software that each store manager relied on. Mrs. Fields was one of the first food companies to integrate advanced computer technology into operations. Randy's software streamlined inventory, production, sales management across the stores. One manager was quoted as saying, "It's a cool tool for me. Allows me to focus on my customers and crew and meet my revenue goals." Remember, this was back in the 80s. Advanced tools like this were not very common. Again, I think this is one of the things that Debbie did so wonderfully as a leader. Sam Zamuri, who in our last video had talked about Sam the Banana Man, he said, "I'm down here, you're up there," when he was talking to management. The people doing the work are really the ones that matter the most in terms of driving quality. Les Schwab had a very similar mindset with his companies. He only valued really the people with boots on the ground actually changing the tires and not very much the office teams looking at the numbers. Something else that was fun about Mrs. Fields was that anybody in the Fields organization could be asked to change jobs at any time. This is something that was shared in a book called Small Giants about Zingerman's. There were several other food-related companies, but the Zing Train philosophy, known as the bottom line training, generally involves employees learning and experiencing a variety of different roles within the company. This is yet another moment that Debbie Fields knew what needed to happen to have the environment be right. People will appreciate other people's contributions if they participate even briefly in their role. Debbie may have had an unorthodox leadership style, but she never yelled. And she told the Ford Times, "I really never have to yell at work. Most people respond better to encouragement." Her encouragement, respect for the bakers' work, willingness to work alongside the team, problem-solving abilities, and Randy's financial acumen and nudges, they had built an excellent culture of hard work, fun, and pride. From what we can tell, people loved working at Mrs. Fields. Again, the quality and initiatives and demand led to 2 decades of explosive growth. They cut a deal with Marriott to be inserted into their hotels. Mrs. Fields, the world's largest producer and retailer of cookies, agreed to license the Marriott Corporation to produce and sell Mrs. Fields products in stores and owned and operated by the Marriott. They expanded into malls and dominated food courts across the country. It seemed like they'd put a cookie shop in every mall in America. Between 1977 and 1988, she went from running a single cookie shop to being the queen of the American shopping mall as president of a company with 275 stores, 78% of which were in malls. Now, the company had funded their growth through debt and exploded with success until about 1992, when they ended up having to sell for $100 million. Now, that might sound great, but the extreme debt load for rapid expansion caused them to give up 80% of the company to banks to write down the debt. Also, malls in general started to perform more poorly. Health and wellness pushes were happening throughout the U.S. Light beer, as an example, became a thing. Miller Lite had just come out and barely had 4% market share. Organic wasn't even a thing. I mean, Bud Light came out in 1982, Coors Light 1978. They tried to partner several times. I really had a hard time with their marriage, as you might imagine. This much debt, this much stress, looking at losing the business that you'd spent 2 decades building was not going over well. And Les Schwab went through the same thing, and there's a lot about that in his book. He used to say, "I walk the floor at nights. Life is hard." With the recapitalization done, expansion was planned with 100 new stores. Now, at this time, she was still involved deeply. They were expanding with franchises outside of the U.S. One of my favorite stories in particular is when she tried to open in Japan. They launched the store, and no one was taking the samples, let alone buying cookies. The next day, she dropped everything, and she flew to Japan the next day. Got in the store herself, identified why people weren't taking the samples, and came up with a solution and did in fact solve the problem. She had little napkins put under each sample of cookies and separated them much further because it seemed more sanitary, and that whole environment was extremely clean, and it worked very well. Then she went back to the US because she had solved the problem and sales in Japan had taken off. Again, coming up with an idea for how to solve a problem and doing it very quickly. There's a lot to learn about picking locations when you're talking about a retail business. She says, "We now know better. We study the demographic charts of any location, and we also send someone we trust to stand out in front and literally count the people." Remember, there's not AI to help back then. They had to make decisions with the information they had available, and oftentimes, in her case, it meant boots on the ground. And perhaps this is a lesson learned, but it's not a crazy idea. This is the way that Warby Parker used school buses to choose retail locations. Warby purchased and refurnished a yellow school bus, the Warby Parker Class Trip Bus, that it drove around the country for 9 months while developing a database of customer feedback. What really they were doing was parking the bus in specific locations, and if sales were good at that location, they'd open a store there. If not, they wouldn't. Boots on the ground. By 1994, Debbie Fields had been ousted as an operator of the company. She began writing books, and in 1996, she hosted a PBS television series, Debbie Fields' Great American Desserts. She was even a judge and mentor in a TV show, Supermarket Superstars, and a show called Foods That Built America. And in 2000, Capricorn Investments acquired Mrs. Fields. Unfortunately, in 2008, the Great Recession, they filed for prepackaged Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Years later, they almost went through another bankruptcy, but the Carlyle Group and Z Capital had stepped in as majority stakeholders. It wasn't until 2019 that Famous Brands International expanded its digital footprint, leveraging online platforms to boost sales and customer engagement for Mrs. Fields. I think this had a lot to do with the fact that Crumble Cookies had started a couple years before that and had already reached $1 billion in sales. They had modernized their packaging and brand image while retaining some of the nostalgic appeal. As of July 2022, Mrs. Fields had 125 retail locations. And in 2023, Mrs. Fields and TCBY parent company was acquired by Pearl Street Equity. The Famous Brands' current footprint has more than 350 franchise locations in the US, Canada, and Australia, Hong Kong, Morocco, Panama, Taiwan, the Bahamas, and from what I can tell, a thriving website. In my opinion, Mrs. Fields Cookies is one of the best brands in America, a household name that everyone knows what they sell. But there is plenty of opportunity ahead for the brand. From what I can gather in their digital presence, it seems to me that they're a gifting brand, and we're not buying for ourselves, we're buying for others. That means there's spectacular opportunity to bring this brand back to a self-interest, personal purchase environment. In future videos, we'll talk about what that opportunity looks like. Thanks for listening to this story about Mrs. Fields, one of my favorite entrepreneurial stories. We'll see you in the next video.